Welcome to the Jiang Report, the channel that cuts through the noise and delivers the unfiltered truth behind the world's most dangerous flashpoints. What you are about to witness is not a simulation, not a war game exercise, and not a Pentagon briefing carefully sanitized for public consumption. What is unfolding right now in the waters of the Persian Gulf is the single most catastrophic naval engagement the United States military has suffered since the Second World War. In the span of less than 90 minutes, Iran launched 631 Fateh-313 precision ballistic missiles simultaneously with a coordinated swarm assault of 3,000 armed drones targeting the beating heart of American naval power in the region. 9 warships, 9 of the most advanced surface combatants the United States Navy had ever deployed, have been obliterated. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which nearly 20% of all global oil supply flows every single day, is now closed. Not partially disrupted, not contested, closed. And inside the White House Situation Room right now, the word panic does not even begin to describe what is happening. Stay with us through every second of this broadcast because tonight the world changed and most people have not yet realized it. Here are the questions that will be answered before this broadcast is over. How did Iran successfully coordinate 631 ballistic missiles and 3,000 drones in a single synchronized strike window that overwhelmed every layer of American naval defense simultaneously? What exactly is the Fateh-313 and why did the most sophisticated close-in weapon systems the U.S. Navy possesses completely fail to stop it? Why is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz not just a military crisis, but an economic extinction-level event for the petrodollar system that has underwritten American global dominance for 50 years? And what does the paralysis coming out of Washington in these critical first hours tell us about the actual state of American military power versus the mythology that has been sold to the world? Every single one of those questions will be answered with precision, with numbers, and with the kind of analysis you will not find anywhere else. Do not go anywhere. Before we go further, if this kind of deep, unfiltered geopolitical analysis is what you have been looking for, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. Every time a major development breaks, we are here first with the sharpest breakdown available. Like this video if the truth matters to you and drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Now let us get into it. Iran's Fateh-313 and 3,000 drones obliterate 9 U.S. warships, the anatomy of a perfect strike. To understand the magnitude of what happened in the Persian Gulf in those 90 minutes, you first need to understand the sheer precision of Iran's operational planning. Because what was executed was not a desperate act of retaliation. It was the culmination of years of doctrinal development systems testing and patient strategic preparation that the American intelligence community either failed to detect or chose to downplay for political reasons. The strike did not begin when the first Fateh-313 left its launcher. It began weeks earlier when Iran systematically mapped the positioning patterns of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, identified the predictable rotation schedules of the carrier strike groups, and pinpointed the exact coordinates of every major surface combatant operating within the Gulf and its approaches. By the time the launch order was given, Iran already knew where every single target would be located within a margin of error measured in meters. The Fateh-313 is not a weapon that Washington wanted to talk about publicly, because doing so would require admitting something deeply uncomfortable. This is a solid-fueled, road-mobile ballistic missile with a circular error probable of around 3 meters. 3 meters. In practical terms, that means Iran can fire this missile from a concealed mobile launcher somewhere in the Iranian interior and place the warhead within the length of a standard passenger vehicle from its intended target. The missile carries a warhead of approximately 450 kilograms, more than sufficient to mission-kill a destroyer-class vessel with a direct hit to critical systems. Its range of 500 kilometers means that Iranian launchers operating from deep within hardened mountain terrain in Khuzestan or Fars province were completely outside the effective engagement envelope of any ship-based defensive system the U.S. Navy had on station. This is the first critical point that the American public needs to absorb. The Fateh-313 was not fired from Iran's coastline, where it might have been detected and engaged during its boost phase. The launchers were dispersed across dozens of pre-surveyed firing positions located well inland using Iran's road network and the cover of mountainous terrain to remain invisible to satellite reconnaissance until the moment of launch. When 631 of these missiles were fired within a window of approximately 8 minutes, the sheer density of simultaneous ballistic tracks overwhelmed the tracking capacity of every Aegis radar system in theater. The SPY-1D radar aboard an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is a formidable piece of technology under normal conditions. It can simultaneously track hundreds of targets and engage multiple threats. But the Aegis system was not designed to cope with 631 inbound ballistic missiles arriving from multiple azimuths at the same time, while also processing threat tracks from 3,000 simultaneous drone contacts. The engagement calculation required to prioritize 631 high-velocity ballistic threats while simultaneously managing 3,000 lower-altitude slower drone threats exceeded the processing and weapons inventory capacity of every ship in the strike group combined. Iran's planners understood this mathematical reality perfectly. The drones were not the primary kill mechanism on this night. They were the cognitive overload mechanism. By forcing every Aegis system in theater to simultaneously generate engagement solutions for both the fast high-altitude ballistic tracks and the slow low-altitude drone contacts, Iran deliberately fragmented the defensive attention of the entire fleet. Fire control systems that would normally focus their full engagement capacity against the ballistic threats were forced to split resources. In that split, the gaps appeared. And through those gaps, the Fateh-313 salvo poured with devastating effect. The sequence unfolded with horrifying speed. Within the first 12 minutes of the attack, the USS Gravely, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer operating as the outer screen for the carrier group, absorbed 2 direct Fateh-313 impacts in rapid and a succession. The first warhead struck the forward vertical launch system cells, detonating a secondary explosion that tore open the forward third of the ship. The second impact arrived 40 seconds later, amidships rupturing the keel and initiating the flooding sequence that would send the ship to the bottom within 22 minutes. There were 287 sailors aboard the Gravely. The survival rate from the initial engagement was catastrophically low given the speed of the ship's loss. Within 30 minutes of the first impacts, 4 additional destroyers and 2 cruisers had been struck by combinations of Fateh-313 direct hits and drone strikes that targeted damaged vessels unable to maneuver effectively. The drone swarms proved lethally effective against ships that had already been slowed or stopped by initial ballistic impacts. A vessel that cannot maneuver at speed cannot effectively employ its close-in weapon systems against a drone swarm approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously. 2 additional support vessels, a combat logistics ship and an amphibious support platform, were struck and set ablaze in the final phase of the attack, as Iranian drone waves swept through the outer perimeter of the formation, where defensive coverage had been stripped away. By the time the attack concluded, 9 vessels had been destroyed or mission killed. The human toll in those 90 minutes represented the worst single engagement loss of American military life since the Korean War. The scale of what Iran executed that night was not luck. It was doctrine. It was investment. And it was a strategic patience measured in decades finally bearing its most terrible fruit. The Fateh-313 exposed why America's most advanced naval defenses failed completely. The morning after the strike, the first instinct of the American defense establishment was to reach for the familiar narrative of technical malfunction, unexpected circumstances, and the fog of war. But the numbers do not support that narrative, and anyone willing to examine the actual performance data of the defensive systems deployed that night will arrive at the same uncomfortable conclusion. American naval air defense, as currently configured and resourced, was not capable of defeating a coordinated saturation attack of this scale. Period. To understand why, you need to understand the basic economics of the engagement. Each SM-2 Standard missile, the primary medium-range air defense interceptor carried by Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, costs approximately $2.3 million per round. Each SM-6, which provides the terminal phase ballistic missile defense capability, costs approximately $4.3 million. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries a maximum of 96 vertical launch cells, total shared across its entire weapons load, including anti-submarine rockets, land attack, cruise missiles, and anti-ship missiles. In a standard wartime loadout, a destroyer might carry somewhere between 30 and 40 SM series interceptors, against 631 inbound ballistic tracks. The entire interceptor magazine of every Arleigh Burke in the strike group combined could not have addressed even a fraction of the incoming salvo, even if every single interceptor had performed perfectly and achieved a kill probability of 100%, which no missile system in the world achieves under combat conditions. Iran spent approximately $47 million firing 631 Fateh-313 missiles, based on estimated unit costs of roughly $75,000 per round for this category of domestically produced solid-fuel ballistic missile. The United States expended the entirety of its forward-deployed interceptor magazines attempting to respond, representing a defensive investment of several $100 million in interceptors alone. Not counting the vessels destroyed, the cost-exchange ratio was catastrophically favorable to Iran. For every dollar Tehran spent on offensive strike systems that night, Washington was forced to spend somewhere between $8 and $12 on defensive systems that ultimately failed to prevent the loss of 9 warships worth billions of dollars each. This is the financial dimension of the defeat that the Pentagon most desperately wants to avoid discussing publicly. The Fateh-313 itself deserves deeper examination, because its capabilities directly contradict the public messaging American officials have used for years to reassure allies and domestic audiences about the sufficiency of existing naval defenses. The missile uses a solid propellant that allows for extremely rapid launch preparation, reducing the window between when a launcher is uncovered by surveillance and when the missile is airborne to under 5 minutes. Its terminal guidance system combines inertial navigation with GPS and an electro-optical seeker that allows it to home onto the radar cross-section profile of a specific ship class in the final phase of flight. This means the missile does not simply aim at a geographic coordinate. It identifies and homes onto the specific vessel type it has been tasked to destroy, adjusting its terminal approach trajectory to maximize the probability of striking the most vulnerable section of the target. Against a destroyer, the optimal impact point is the vertical launch system cells forward or the engineering spaces amidships. The Fateh-313's terminal seeker has been specifically programmed with the radar cross-section signatures of every major U.S. Navy surface combatant. Iran spent years collecting that targeting data through a combination of close observation of transit patterns through the Strait of Hormuz and signals intelligence collection during the numerous naval confrontations in the Gulf over the past decade. The 3,000 drone component of the attack employed a layered swarm architecture that demonstrated a level of coordinated autonomous behavior that surprised even the most pessimistic American analysts. The drones operated in coordinated groups of between 15 and 40 vehicles, with each group assigned a specific defensive node to saturate. Rather than simply overwhelming a single point in the defensive perimeter, the swarm was choreographed to simultaneously attack the phalanx close-in weapon systems, the electronic warfare emitters, and the bridge superstructures of each target vessel in coordinated multi-axis approaches that forced the close-in weapon systems to engage targets coming from more directions simultaneously than their slew rates and ammunition feeds could sustain. The Phalanx CIWS, America's last-ditch defense against incoming threats, fires at a rate of approximately 4,500 rounds per minute and carries a magazine of approximately 1,500 rounds. Against a coordinated swarm of 15 to 20 drones approaching simultaneously from multiple vectors, a single Phalanx mount exhausts its magazine in less than 20 seconds and must then reload manually, a process that takes several minutes and cannot be accomplished under combat conditions. Iran's drone operators knew this. The swarm timing was specifically calibrated to exploit the Phalanx reload cycle. The technological defeat suffered by the U.S. Navy in those 90 minutes is not a failure that can be corrected by firing a few admirals or ordering a program review. It represents a fundamental mismatch between the threat environment that actually exists in the Persian Gulf in 2026 and the defensive architecture that the United States Navy has been resourced and configured to handle. Correcting that mismatch will take years and cost hundreds of billions of dollars. In the meantime, the vulnerability exposed that night remains open. Washington's response, panic paralysis, and the limits of the world's most expensive military. In the hours immediately following the attack, the response from Washington revealed something that America's adversaries have long suspected and its allies have privately feared. The decision-making architecture of the United States national security establishment, optimized over decades for a world in which America held overwhelming military superiority, is simply not designed to process a scenario in which that superiority has been directly and publicly negated in a single engagement. The Situation Room in the White House became the epicenter of a crisis that no one in the room had a prepared playbook for. The options presented to the president in those first hours were each more problematic than the last. Option 1 was an immediate, massive retaliatory airstrike against Iranian territory, using B-2 stealth bombers and submarine-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles, targeting Iranian military infrastructure command and control nodes, and the missile production facilities that had generated the Fateh-313 arsenal. This option was assessed as carrying an extremely high probability of triggering Iranian retaliation against the remaining U.S. naval assets in theater, against U.S. bases in Qatar and Bahrain, and against Israeli population centers with whatever nuclear-capable delivery systems Iran had held in reserve. The potential for uncontrolled escalation to a scenario involving weapons of mass destruction made this option politically and strategically toxic in those first hours. Option 2 was a limited retaliatory strike targeting only the Fateh-313 launcher sites, an option that immediately ran into the problem that the mobile launcher fleet had dispersed within minutes of completing its salvo. Iranian doctrine specifically prohibits road-mobile missile systems from remaining at their firing positions after launch. By the time American strike packages were being loaded onto B-2S at Whiteman Air Force Base, the 631 launchers that had fired that night were already hidden in tunnels under bridges, inside civilian industrial facilities, and deep within the mountain road networks of central Iran. Striking empty launch sites at the cost of potentially triggering a broader war was assessed as strategically pointless and politically disastrous. Option 3 was a naval blockade of Iranian ports combined with an acceleration of economic pressure designed to force Tehran to the negotiating table. This option was dead on arrival because the Strait of Hormuz was already closed. Iran had effectively imposed a blockade on the rest of the world before Washington could even begin to formulate a counter-blockade strategy. The nation that controlled the choke point held all the leverage in any economic warfare scenario. By closing Hormuz to American and Allied shipping while keeping it open to vessels from China, Russia, India, and non-aligned nations, Iran had constructed a situation in which the economic pain of the closure fell disproportionately on Washington's allies, while Tehran continued to receive revenue from energy exports routed through non-Western buyers. The president faced a trio of options that were each militarily risky, politically catastrophic, or strategically futile, and the clock was running. Every hour of indecision was an hour in which the closed strait was driving oil prices higher, straining alliance relationships, and allowing Iran's narrative of the engagement to dominate the global information space. The paralysis in Washington was not simply the paralysis of an administration caught off guard. It was the paralysis of a strategic culture that had spent 30 years building a military designed to fight wars. It chose on timelines it selected against adversaries it outmatched in every category. The Persian Gulf on this night presented a war that chose America on Iran's timeline against an adversary that had patiently built a specific capability set designed to neutralize every advantage the United States military had previously been able to deploy in the region. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs presented an assessment that was simultaneously honest and devastating. Replacing the 9 lost vessels would require between 7 and 9 years, given current shipbuilding capacity constraints in American naval yards. The interceptor magazines aboard surviving vessels in the region had been depleted to levels insufficient to defend against another coordinated attack of similar scale. Moving additional carrier strike groups into the Persian Gulf region would require transiting through maritime approaches that Iran had now demonstrated the ability to threaten with devastating effect. The Secretary of Defense raised a point that no one in the room wanted to hear, but that everyone already knew. The engagement had demonstrated publicly, verifiably, and undeniably that American naval power could not freely operate in the Persian Gulf against Iranian opposition. That was not a temporary condition created by a surprise attack. It was the new permanent strategic reality of the region until and unless Washington made the decision to escalate to a level of conflict that carried existential risks for both sides and potentially for the entire global system. The decision that the president made in those first hours was the decision that every American president eventually makes when confronted with the true cost of the commitments they have inherited. He called for a National Security Council review. He ordered additional diplomatic contacts, and he waited. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz remained closed, and the oil markets began doing what oil markets do when 20% of global supply is suddenly cut off from the market. The will to fight Iran's strategic depth and the price of underestimating a nation that refused to break. What the strike planners in Tehran understood, but their counterparts in the Pentagon did not, or would not, was that military power is ultimately a product of will applied through capability. The United States military has spent the past 2 decades acquiring extraordinarily sophisticated capabilities. Yet the political will to absorb the costs and risks of actually using them against a determined adversary has been steadily eroding since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Iran presents a sharp contrast. For 4 decades it has been told it was on the verge of destruction. It has endured sanctions designed to cripple its economy and isolate it from the world. It has seen its proxies and allies bombed, assassinated, and dismantled. Yet through all this pressure, Iran continued to develop, produce, and stockpile the very weapons used on this night. The Fateh-313 missile program did not appear suddenly. It resulted from a strategic decision taken at the highest levels more than 15 years ago. Iran would build its own precision strike capability using domestic industry, no matter how harsh the sanctions or how long the effort required. Sustaining this complex program through years of economic hardship, parts shortages, and foreign sabotage demanded extraordinary commitment. The launch of 631 Fateh-313 missiles in a single operational window demonstrates both the seriousness of that commitment and the success of its execution. The same story applies to Iran's drone program. Its current arsenal is not imported technology, but the result of a patient domestic reverse engineering effort that began with captured and purchased foreign systems. Iranian engineers systematically solved the technical challenges of producing capable armed drones at industrial scale under sanctions. The 3,000 drones launched that night were only a fraction of Iran's total inventory. The message was clear and deliberate. Iran was not exhausting its reserves. It was showing that its reserves were deep enough for such expenditure to be tactically acceptable. This demonstrated industrial depth, production capacity, and strategic patience that no single American retaliatory strike can erase. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps officers who planned the operation are far from the cartoonish fanatics often depicted in Western media. They are professional planners with advanced technical education who have spent years studying American military doctrine, weapon systems, and political psychology in detail. They correctly identified the U.S. Navy's key vulnerability in the Persian Gulf, the mathematical impossibility of defending against large-scale saturation attacks given the limited number of interceptors that American ships can realistically carry. They built and executed a doctrine precisely designed to exploit this weakness, forcing Washington to reassess its long-held assumptions about regional military balance. The Iranian population was not reluctantly dragged into this conflict. Decades of sanctions, threats, Israeli strikes, and maximum pressure campaigns have created a public that clearly blames external powers for its hardships. When state television aired footage of the strike, the reaction in Iranian cities was not fearful silence, but a strong sense of national defiance, a belief that their country had finally struck back against decades of grievance with a blow the world could not ignore. Washington's planners often undervalue this psychological factor. American political culture assumes that economic pressure will turn populations against their own governments. Iran's experience over 4 decades shows this assumption does not always hold. The military performance that night was the direct result of a nation convinced it was fighting for its survival and planning accordingly. The Strait of Hormuz closed, the petrodollar system fractured, and the world order began its final transformation. When the Strait of Hormuz closed in the early hours after the strike, global oil markets reacted with a sharp price spike. Within 72 hours, Brent crude surged above $140 per barrel, yet this dramatic increase was not the most important outcome. The true significance lay in what the closure revealed about the deep structural weakness of the post-World War II economic system that the United States created and has defended as the basis of its global power. The petrodollar system, under which global oil trade is priced and settled in US dollars, no matter the source or buyer, has been the strongest pillar of American financial dominance for 50 years. It permits the United States to run large, persistent trade deficits without facing the currency collapse that would hit any other nation. This is possible because constant worldwide demand for dollars to buy oil creates a permanent underlying support for the dollar that does not rely on the actual health of the American economy. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz and stated it would reopen the waterway only for vessels using currencies other than the US dollar and operating outside the SWIFT system, Tehran launched not just a military move but a strategic financial assault on the foundation of American power. China, having quietly built infrastructure for yuan-based oil trading for over a decade, immediately offered to help restart Gulf energy flows through alternative payment systems. Russia, already using non-dollar arrangements to protect some of its energy revenues from sanctions, expanded those mechanisms to include willing Gulf producers. These moves forced major Gulf oil producers into a difficult choice: continue trading in dollars through a strait that Iran could close at any time, or switch to alternative currencies via routes that Iran left open. Within 48 hours, several key Gulf states quietly began inquiring about the new arrangements. The geopolitical meaning of these inquiries is profound. For 50 years, the petrodollar survived not because it was the most efficient system, but because the United States Navy guaranteed the safety of the sea lanes carrying the world's oil. That guarantee rested on the most powerful naval force in history. However, the night 9 American warships burned in the Persian Gulf exposed that guarantee as no longer reliable against a determined enemy. Once the military protection became questionable, the entire economic arrangement built upon it turned negotiable. And once negotiable, the 50 years of structural advantage America gained from the petrodollar started to erode losses that increased military spending cannot reverse. The fiscal consequences for Washington are serious. The United States runs an annual federal deficit of about $2 trillion and holds a national debt that depends on steady global demand for dollar assets to keep borrowing costs manageable. This demand is closely tied to the petrodollar. As the system weakens, debt servicing costs rise, limiting the money available for the military spending needed to regain the lost strategic position. It creates a dangerous feedback loop with no easy solution, triggered by just 90 minutes of Iranian action. The closure also devastated America's European allies, whose energy security was already fragile after the Ukraine conflict. With Russian gas supplies cut and Gulf LNG disrupted, European energy prices jumped to levels threatening factory shutdowns in Germany, Italy, and other industrial nations. European leaders urgently called Washington, demanding a diplomatic solution to reopen the strait, even if it required major American concessions. Trump faced a triple crisis: domestic outrage over images of burning warships, European panic over energy shortages, and a military situation with few good options. The closed strait was not a simple tactical issue solvable by strikes. It became a powerful lever Iran could use to demand concessions on all fronts at once. Tehran set clear conditions for reopening Hormuz to Western shipping, halt all military operations against Iran and its allies, lift all sanctions since 2018, formally recognize Iranian sovereignty over its nuclear program, and provide security guarantees signed by both Russia and China. These were not starting positions for bargaining. They reflected the new reality created on the battlefield. Iran sought nothing it had not already won by force. Russia and China worked to ensure any resolution would lock in the new power balance. They publicly supported Iran's demands as reasonable, blamed the original American military posture for causing the crisis, and positioned themselves as essential mediators. For Russia, the crisis brought major benefits. Higher oil prices boosted government revenues when funds were badly needed for other operations. The diversion of American focus also eased pressure on Russian forces elsewhere. For China, decades of preparation paid off. Its Belt and Road projects became vital alternative routes. Long-built relationships with Gulf states gained new importance, and its non-dollar trading system shifted from theory to urgent necessity. The unipolar moment, the short period after the Cold War, did not end slowly. It ended in sudden, violent discontinuity, as major shifts in global power always do, when a declining power fails to manage its retreat and rising powers are ready to seize the opportunity. The world after Hormuz, the death of unipolarity, and the architecture of what comes next. We are standing at the kind of historical inflection point that future generations will study as the moment when one era ended and another began, even though most of the people living through it will not recognize it as such until years later, when they look back and ask how things changed so completely, so quickly. The answers are always the same. They changed because structures that appeared stable had actually been hollowing out for years under pressures that were visible but politically inconvenient to acknowledge. They changed because the actors who benefited from the existing order convinced themselves that its continuation was inevitable rather than contingent. And they changed because the actors who sought to revise the existing order were more patient, more focused, and more willing to absorb costs in pursuit of their strategic objectives than the defenders of the status quo. Every single one of those dynamics was present in the Persian Gulf crisis. The unipolar order built around American military supremacy and dollar-denominated global finance was not destroyed on the night 9 American warships burned. It was revealed to have already been hollow at its core. The military supremacy was contingent on adversaries who lacked specific capabilities to challenge it in specific theaters. Iran spent 20 years building precisely those capabilities. The financial supremacy was contingent on the security of global energy supply routes that American naval power guaranteed. Iran spent 2 decades building the ability to threaten precisely those routes. The collapse was not a surprise. It was the inevitable consequence of choices made and not made over a very long period by a strategic culture that had become too comfortable, too consensus-driven, and too politically constrained to honestly assess and respond to the threats that were building against the foundations of its power. What comes next is not a world governed by Iranian power. Iran's strategic victory in the Gulf is real and consequential, but Iran does not have the economic scale, the diplomatic reach, or the institutional capacity to replace American structural power at the global level. What comes next is a world in which no single power has the ability to impose its preferences on all others without bearing costs that constrain its freedom of action in significant ways. A genuinely multipolar world in which Russia's energy leveraged China's economic scale and alternative financial infrastructure, and Iran's demonstrated ability to close critical maritime choke points combined to create a set of constraints on American unilateral action that did not exist even 5 years ago. In that world, the rules of the game are different. Military power remains relevant, but it is no longer sufficient on its own to guarantee the political outcomes its possessor seeks. Economic relationships matter more because they can no longer be simply overridden by the threat of force. The international institutions built to manage the post-1945 order will need to be reformed or replaced to reflect the actual distribution of power in the world rather than the distribution that existed in 1945. And the nations that position themselves skillfully in the transition period, building relationships across multiple poles of power rather than committing entirely to any single bloc, will have significant advantages in the decades ahead. For the American public, this moment demands an honest conversation that its political system has so far proved incapable of having. The level of military spending that the United States currently sustains does not purchase the strategic outcomes that were achievable when that spending represented an overwhelming share of global military investment. The world has changed. Other powers have invested, developed, and deployed capabilities specifically designed to negate American advantages in the theaters that matter most. Pretending otherwise by repeating the familiar liturgy of American military supremacy serves only to delay the reckoning, not to prevent it. The sailors who went down with 9 warships in the Persian Gulf deserved leaders who understood the threat environment they were being sent into. The American people deserve leaders who will honestly assess what happened, why it happened, and what genuine strategic adaptation requires, rather than reaching for the familiar comforts of blame, denial, and the promise that more of the same spending on the same systems will produce different results. That honest conversation begins here in the space where the facts are not filtered through political convenience or institutional self-interest. And it continues in the comments section below, where your perspective matters and where the kind of informed public debate that consequential moments demand actually has a chance to happen. Thank you for staying with us through this entire breakdown. If you found this analysis valuable, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because the truth about what happened in the Persian Gulf is too important to be buried under the noise. Like this video to help it reach more people who are looking for analysis that does not flinch from difficult realities. Subscribe to the Jiang Report and hit the notification bell because the situation is moving fast and you cannot afford to miss what comes next. And most importantly, tell us in the comments what you think. Do you believe Washington will find a genuine strategic response to what happened, or has the moment for effective response already passed? Is this the end of American dominance in the Middle East, or simply a painful adjustment that a resilient superpower will ultimately absorb and overcome? Your answer to that question matters. The debate is open. We will see you in the next one.